Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Or good morning, everyone. At CJ, and today is Friday, March the 12th. Happy Friday. Hopefully, everyone's getting all excited and ready for the weekend. And very excited today to be joined with London Paul of theseriesreport.com. Make sure to go over to theseriesreport.com and check out Paul's exclusive work that he does there in regards to his premium content, his daily podcast. Paul, great day. How are you, sir?
Yes, I'm very well. How are you, CJ?
I'm doing great, Paul. It's very interesting the last few days, just some of the news, some of the information in regards to not only what the United States is doing in regards to the South China Sea, but also what's happening somewhat in the backyard of the United States as well, Paul.
Yeah, and we thought it'd be a good opportunity to talk about sort of developments in Mexico. Um, Obviously, from the Trump era, we know there was all the much vaunted "let's build a wall," which never got built, or was partially built, was never financed. Mexicans didn't pay a dime towards it. The usual nonsensical rhetoric. But what I'm quite surprised at is the sort of like the US gets rather sort of irate when China's making inroads or Russia's making inroads into the Middle East or Africa, but they seem to have taken, or potentially at least taken, their eye off the ball with regards to Mexico. And given obviously Mexico shares a border with the United States and their natural paranoia that everything's a threat to the United States if it's 10,000 miles away, they don't seem to be too bothered about a perceived threat, which you would have to put in the same context right on their doorstep. And it's worth just discussing China with regards to China and Russia. I mean, they have kind of very different relationships. Russia's is more mature with Mexico, where China is less so, but it's increasingly seeming to be, the case, unsurprisingly, that probably on the back of less than solid relations during the Trump administration era. Obrador, who gets called AMLO, is obviously the president of Mexico, is increasingly seeming to be pretty receptive to have stronger ties with China. And obviously, if there is any significant increase in Chinese influence, this could be, with China taking stake in Mexican businesses. It could be ports. It could be, all manner of things. It relates to banking and finance, but anything you would perceive would have, in principle, strong implications for US security. And you would think that the United States would suddenly start to get extremely angry and irate about this. And thus far, they haven't. Whether it's they're unaware of China's there, or the extent to which China could be making moves there, is one thing. But if they are aware of it, they don't seem to be particularly bothered about it. But as we know, kind of, even though there's sort of fraught relations on some level between the US and Mexico, they do have some kind of relationship when it comes to security cooperation. And obviously, the US is not really a partner in domestic security matters, but they share a border, so there has to be cooperation. We know there's enormous amounts of drug trafficking, human trafficking, and who knows what else gets trafficked across the border. And it was why the wall was rather pointless, because there's enormous tunnel or network of tunnels that crisscross the border between Mexico and obviously the United States. But the chat, it seems like currently within the last, I would say, 6 months or so, that this kind of Chinese Mexican relationship is going to start to sort of blossom and mature. And part of that obviously related to the pandemic in providing equipment, but also that it appears that the Mexicans have been asking the Chinese to assist and give them some advice and to do with the drug war, which kind of was a bit of an eye opener. I was very surprised to see they would do that. I'm not quite sure what the motivation is particularly, but because it's not like they don't have other allies they could work with. Maybe it's something to do with how China deals with its own drug wars internally within its country, which of course it does have a huge problem, or has. I mean, it's contained a lot of it, but it's still a big problem, as it is anywhere else. But the truth is, I mean, we know that China has a huge presence and a growing one across Latin America, but in terms of Mexico, trade's pretty small. And to put this in context, when you look at relations and China in the last sort of 20 years, it grew sort of almost 20-fold. It was around 15 billion in the early 2000s, and I'm not sure what the figure is for 2020, but it had grown to sort of 320, 330 billion by the end of 2019. And also Chinese investment, and this is worth knowing, in the last decade is been around $150 billion. Now, of course, a lot of people say, well, China just printed money, and they didn't. This is Chinese money that it has accrued from its buoyant trade for decades, and it's spending dollars and investing it in assets, and that just proves 140, $150 billion in a decade, and it's growing all the time, shows the influence they have in Latin America. And of course, the US has been trying to contain that influence in places like Brazil, as one obvious example, but not exclusively, also Argentina, Chile, etc. But of course, when you put this in context, it's very, very small amount. We're talking less than $10 billion of that sort of money was invested into Mexico. In terms of their import-export market is very, very small. And there hasn't actually really been any really strong or even moderately strong political relations between the two countries. I mean, yeah, they've had visits and some diplomatic dialogue, but it's been pretty muted. But of course, what a surprise again, and this has been very prevalent across the entire world. When the pandemic started, then the Chinese went on a charm offensive, and this time it was with Mexico. They've supplied PPE equipment, and they've now given them I think it's about 35 million doses of one of the, I'm not sure which Chinese vaccine is, or they're due to give them in the coming months, and they're going to expand as a basis of that the strategic partnership, because it was seen as a goodwill gesture. Okay, yeah, we're not disputing China's going to profit from selling vaccines. Let's not deny that obvious factor, but it's kind of been this watershed moment with a lot of nations where it broke a lot of ice between them. And I wouldn't say there was an ice between Mexico and China, but most certainly it was a sort of bridge building exercise. And what's often deterred China or Mexico engaging really with China in the past is obviously the whole NAFTA agreement, which politically sort of, or geopolitically stunted relations with the Chinese. That seems as though that might be changing. And of course, there is quite strong nationalism in Mexico, so there's been a lot of resistance. I mean, even resistance between the US and Mexico relations. So therefore, when you put that in context, China is just remain this nation that's thousands of miles away, and we don't particularly want to deal with them. But what's also caused this sort of re-engagement between the two nations was all the friction that existed between Mexico and Trump, or Trump's administration, and therefore on the basis of that, there's now this issue. Well, they didn't particularly like the fact they got a lot of criticism from Trump regarding how they handled the immense crime and corruption on all the drug cartels, and Trump had a very valid point about this, of course, but of course that didn't really set a very positive tone between the two nations, and in general relations deteriorated, and it's worth noting as well that the Mexican Congress recently passed a law that effectively restricted the DEA, which anyone's not sure, that's the US Drug Enforcement Agency, operating on Mexican soil. So that was a really sort of severe kind of hammer blow to security cooperation. particularly obviously with respect to drug agencies. And it's interesting, they're now discussing with China the issue of managing the whole sort of drug cartels and how they deal with that side of things. So did they pass the law restricting it because they'd already spoken to the Chinese? I mean, there's a logic that says, well, that's probably the case. And so therefore, obviously, over a period of time that, China's now started to, as the Trump administration weakened relations with allies and neighbors, naturally China just filled the void, and they've got involved in some anti-poverty and anti-corruption push to help them. And there's these consortiums led by Chinese construction companies, and they're going to build. I think there's a railway construction. I'm not sure. I can't remember where it is exactly. Of course, this starts to build this sort of geostrategic, geoeconomic capability to start to boost economic development in parts of Mexico, and principally, I think this relates to southern Mexico. And of course, there is some investment in the energy sector. I think back probably 7-8 years ago, China then agreed to create an energy fund, and that was with Pemex, which is the Mexican state oil company. And that also involved the CNPC, which is China's National Petroleum Corporation, and the Chinese Development Bank and the Industrial Commercial Bank of China. So they did have some blossoming relations going back, but they now seem to be, since the pandemic, putting their foot down more on the accelerator. And there has been loans for the construction of refineries in Mexico. And at times, and this is something China does quite often, they'll go into areas and go, well, it might not be financially viable to do this. It may be a bit of a loss leader, but let's invest in something, because what you do is you get, in this case, the Mexicans on board, say, well, you're prepared to loan money. It's a loss leader, but you see there's bigger gains to be made. It sort of develops cooperation. It develops trust. And on the back of things like this, of course, then China starts to get invited to be involved in other, projects in terms of bilateral trade. And in a way, kind of some of the policy decisions that Mexico wants to be involved in, where they like to have probably more state control over certain sectors in the economy. They don't want the US influence. They have more of a kind of, well, for want of a better description, a social welfare system. And that sort of, they find Beijing's kind of attitude to those things appealing. Now, obviously, I'm not expecting the US-Mexican relations to fall off a cliff edge overnight, but you would expect to see going forward, China's going to have a lot of presence in key sectors of the Mexican economy, and you're going to see more and more political cooperation. And of course, the US is going to increasingly start seeing this. And what's the fallout going to be with regards to Mexico? I mean, we know the US has a tendency, if it doesn't like a leader in the country, they'll try and find a way of removing. So is AMLO's days as a Mexican president number? No, I don't think so. But it's going to create friction. It's going to create animosity. It's also going to sort of cause the more anti-Mexican elements within the Beltway and the Congress to become more and more vocal. But there is certainly moves, and when it's on the US's doorstep, then you'd have to think that already the US seems to be aware of these things, but thus far it doesn't. And I'm quite surprised by this, because after all, they share a common border.
Yeah, it's it's a very interesting dynamic that's unfolding, in part to witness Mexico doing this, and I think we understand all the reasons why, in terms of the force in regards to the trade, in regards to the influence that the United States has had with Mexico for several years. It's interesting to watch that, the pivot taking place currently with Mexico's current president. One of the things that caught my eye, Paul, was in witnessing Mexico's choice for the COVID vaccine. You know, they originally announced that they would start utilizing the Russian vaccine at the time, and that was, you know, because it's more of an antibody type vaccine. But that was just kind of the start of it, which I think definitely will start raising eyebrows here in the United States as we witness Russia and China having more influence in Mexico.
Yeah, and the other thing is there's a lot of developments with regards to Russia as well. That has a bit more of a mature relationship in terms of they have a lot of kind of common beliefs in how international institutions should work, how the UN should function as a body, and also, you know, they have a lot of sort of bilateral relations in terms of there's at an institutional level. So there's a Russian-Mexican Joint Commission for Economic and Commercial, Scientific and Technical Developments. There's also maritime navigation cooperation, and that they're just a couple of examples. And obviously, you get the Mexican government, the business community. They always go to, you know, the International Economic Forum in St. Petersburg, where obviously, you know, when it happens, obviously we've had the pandemic, etc. But also that they've started to suppress the need for and repeal visas between Mexico and Russia. I mean, ironically, Russia's done that a lot for all nations in Latin America and the Caribbean. And in terms of bilateral trade, there's a lot more mature relations. So Russia exports metals and obviously derivatives of metals. There's chemicals, minerals, the machinery, equipment. There's cars, metals and products, and food, agricultural, raw materials. And they're the main items of Mexican imports to Russia. So there is a strong market. They have a lot of energy cooperation. I mean, there's, you know, effectively Russia's had quite a strong presence there for around 5 or 6 years, and that's in oil field exploration and development projects, and you know that involves again Pemex as well, and it seems to be a very fruitful relationship that's, you know, working extremely well, and you know they've got investments of billions of dollars, and they've also got commitments between obviously what is a leading operator for anyone who doesn't understand the Russian energy sector is called Lukoil. That's Lukoil, and they've had these production agreements between Lukoil and there's a thing called the National Hydrocarbons Commission. That's the CNH of Mexico, and there's plans to continue investing in those markets, and there's definitely a lot of cultural exchanges. The Russian market's open for Mexican businesses. So if you've got a great business idea, then the market's open for you to you know, for Mexican companies to easily operate inside Russia if they want to, and they want to encourage, you know, Mexicans also where appropriate, if it's possible, to invest in Russia. So they've kind of the National Chamber of Commerce of Mexico City has now got some tie-ups with Moscow, and all these things are sort of bridge building, and there are, you know, many companies, Russian companies that specialize in all manner. You can take the whole spectrum of sectors, from, you know, engineering, even education, healthcare, tourism, etc., and in the finance and legal services that are working in cooperation with Mexican counterparts, and there's cultural diplomacy that's developing. So, and these are long-term things. You know, this hasn't happened in the last 12 months or 2 years or 5 years, probably over the last decade or so. There's been, and that's the big difference that you'll find with Russia and China. It's all about relationship building. It's about building trust. It's about, you know, at times making decisions where, okay, we're not going to financially benefit from this, but it's a good kind of loss leader. And you know, then the specialized areas that, you know, like Russia and energy is an obvious example, and they can go in and they've built the trust because the relationship works. They devise contracts that is a win-win for for both, Russian and obviously Mexican companies and oil companies, for example, as we've just highlighted.
Paul, if I
And
could
the
pause,
yes,
if I could pause you for just one moment, because you said something very interesting, and there's been timely news in regards to this, because I think it specifically impacts potential relations with the United States, and that's the fact that we are now learning that Mexico plans to move forward with banning of GMO corn, as well as the elimination of glyphosate herbicide entirely, which we know here in the United States we have not really did accomplish anything in terms of removing GMO from our food supply, and neither have we done anything with glyphosate either. So in terms of seeds, in terms of seed genetics, I imagine the agriculture side of Mexico, that'll tie directly in with Russia, who has also banned GMO corn as they attempt to clean up their food supply. So it's very interesting, and it's going to be even more interesting to see how the United States reacts to this, Paul.
yeah, and the other implication is, if they start to sign more formal agreements on trade deals, and in a more, in a more sort of maybe formalized way and extend, then what's the risk? I mean, okay, NAFTA existed and then it was replaced, but basically it was just NAFTA rebadged as something else. It wasn't really radically different. It hasn't really changed anything. But what's the risk that Mexico starts to go, well, actually, maybe we'll start having more exports and imports with Russia and China to the detriment of the United States and, the nation that's on its own border. And this has potentially huge ramifications for the US if it can't even have meaningful, solid, dependable relations with its neighbors. And this is one of the things that with the Trump administration, and it's another, sadly, a point of criticism, is they did everything to really piss off allies and piss off their neighbors. And there's no other word to use. Well, there's far stronger words, and the consequences are, as he did this, it just left a vacuum and allowed China and Russia to move in and fill the vacuum. Now, okay, it's not quite the same with regards to Mexico because the relationship was already there, but all that's done is solidified the relationship. It's created mistrust and distrust with the United States, and that's why that mistrust and distrust meant like we had with China with regards to PPE and assisting Italy, practically a year ago, because Italy was the start of whatever, and we're not getting into a discussion about what the pandemic is, but anyway, that's where it started in Europe. The European Union didn't do anything, couldn't do anything. The UK didn't do anything. America didn't do anything to help them. Who were the first nation to help them? China, and Italy's never forgotten this. And this is how you start to build trust. You start to build, rapport between nations. And the way China handled it particularly has been an enormous boost in confidence for nations who were believing all manner of things that actually weren't reality with respect to China. Now they're seeing China in a different light. And now, of course, that then opens doors in other ways, and Mexico is a great example of this, and it's not unique. We know it's gone on in Venezuela, where the US has been trying to remove Maduro for longer than we care to remember. You've got Cuba, where still the United States is imposing sanctions on them, and there's strong relations being developed there. And this is across the board. Wherever the US tends to interfere, they're now going, okay, rather than us being completely destroyed, we've got China and Russia as a buffer. China can help us economically, so can Russia to some extent. We've got Russia's capability to help us militarily in some capacity, whether that might be with hardware or strategic advice and sending military advisors in. I don't doubt Russian military advisors have been in Venezuela for the whole time that Guaido was announced as, who's they still trying to make out Guaido as the interim Venezuelan president, etc. So it sets a real precedent in that region. It's on the doorstep of the United States, and you're going to see increasingly just Mexico, and you've got Central America, Southern America, and the Russians and the Chinese are just going to move more and more into there with cooperation agreements, There may be some military element to it in a defensive capability, of course, and then there's all this sort of trade, and then there's infrastructure building to make obviously Southern and Central America can be part of a kind of America's Belt and Road, because ultimately, as we've said, at some point, Alaska is going to join with Russia. It's easy to put some sort of link between the two, and then you can make all the Americas part of the Belt and Road, and hopefully at some point sooner rather than later, the Americas then will become part of it, and then they've got a direct route through Siberia, and they can drop down into Southeast Asia, and then they're not just going to be reliant on shipping as potential, then they can rely on fast rail, and the rail networks that particularly China's building is astonishing. I mean, they're now having heavy investment into maglev trains, and the speed with which these bullet trains are going to make thousands of miles done in literally a couple of hours. That kind of speed. But I think they said Shanghai to Beijing would be 2.5 hours, and I can't remember off the top of my head what the distance is between Shanghai and Beijing, but you get an idea that they're going to build out that infrastructure, and that the same will eventually, of course, have to happen in Siberia, where there's going to be building out of infrastructure. But that's a natural way for the Americas to connect to the Belt and Road through Eurasia. And at some point, when intelligent people come to the fore instead of the lunatics that make decisions now, then that will become a reality. And then that will ultimately be very beneficial to the US when eventually it has an export market, has a manufacturing base at some point in the future, and then can sell its goods to obviously Southeast Asia. But also with proper infrastructure, it can then participate better with Central and South America as well itself. So hopefully that happens sooner rather than later, but don't hold your breath.
Right, and I'm very proud of the steps that Mexico is taking as it relates to GMO, the glyphosate. Like I just had a friend here recently within the past 2 weeks that messaged me looking for alternative treatments because he was diagnosed with colon cancer and late stages and everything, and having lost a brother-in-law, and it's very odd, Paul, that here in the United States we're seeing a lot more people with throat cancers, developing colon cancers at very young ages, at 50 years of age and even younger. So not directly pointing the finger at the genetically modified foods that have been in our supply for a long time, but here in the United States we won't even label products. We won't even properly inform consumers of products that do contain genetically modified typing ingredients and so forth. So, and then you compound that with the overspray of glyphosate and ending up in the water supply and everything else like that. And Mexico is making an honest attempt to say, hey, let's clean this up. Let's do something different. And Mexico is no joke. I mean, if you take a look at their natural resources, not only in terms of oil, which I think that is still yet to be explored, but let's not forget that Mexico is also, I believe, the largest producer of silver as well, Paul.
Yes. Oh, yeah, it has enormous. I mean, we've talked in the past that it has maybe the potential to back its currency with silver. I'm not saying it will do, but it's the one nation that could back the peso with silver in the future. Yeah, it's an enormous silver producer. So again, it's one of those nations. It has resources. It just needs to better define how it and doesn't overexploit resources. But it needs infrastructure. It needs huge amounts of rebuilding. Roads, railways, upgrading ports, and it can become much more of an economically viable, proposition, both internally as an export market. But as ever, Mexico has its own challenges, not least drug cartels. I mean, and it's going to be it's a big challenge, but it's taking steps in the right direction. And the truth of the matter is, if there was a real desire to clean up the whole drug cartels, then it was possible. Now, there's one thing is worth mentioning at this point with regards to it. It was said to me, I don't know, quite a few years back, that eventually there'll be an international concerted effort to clean up all the drug cartels, and it will involve the Russians, the Chinese, and who knows, hopefully, obviously, ultimately the Americans and the Europeans, and there'll be a big move to clean that up. Now, that sounds like a bridge too far, but I can see that becoming a reality, not today, tomorrow, or next week, but I mean, it's something that needs to be done, and also all the trafficking that goes on, etc. I mean, these are enormous challenges that because these spheres of influence are that massive, and they don't just function between obviously Mexico and the United States. Everyone knows it's a global problem, and again, that is all financed with cash. Every single part of it, the whole supply chain of the drug industry is cash related, because then nothing is obviously you can't sort of then track or trace anything of the developments through that whole sort of food chain that exists. And then there's all the other disgusting things that go on in terms of human trafficking and everything else, and that is all financed with cash. So as I say, if people keep saying about cashless societies, it's not a reality. In fact, the irony is, if we actually get around to having a cashless society, it'll be because all these disgusting things that blight this planet will no longer exist, and eventually, at some point in the future, there will be ways of dealing with it. But that doesn't mean it's the end of it. We're going to start into this whole other sort of sector of crime going forward that revolves out the digital economy that's coming. But we say all that with regards to what's going on, and then we have the unfortunate situation of the US kind of leaving some theatres of conflict and wanting to expand into others, and we can just briefly talk about a development in that shortly.
Paul, what would be interesting is, I know for a fact that a lot of Hispanics, Mexicans living here in the United States ship dollars back to Mexico because of the devaluation of the Mexican peso, which has always been, right. It's always been this way. It'd be very interesting to see Mexico make that announcement that, hey, look, we are going to back the peso with our silver. And ironically enough, if people eventually were sending pesos to the United States,
well, yeah,
in a drastic reverse of
yeah, well, yes.
And by the way, that's not financial advice to go buy Mexico pesos right now.
Pesos, no, but it would, if you underpin the currency and gave it stability, it would go a long way. But Americans know the history of Mexico a damn sight better than I do. But what I can say is there are developments, and these are critical, pivotal developments that are going on the US's doorstep and have been for a while, and particularly China's. Well, I mean, probably what happens in the next 2 or 3 years is going to be very telling. But this is just building this new way of doing things. And nations trust. I mean, whatever people think and want to believe about China is fine, but the world sees them as a responsible custodian. They don't agree with everything they do, and no one's ever going to agree with any nation in everything they do. But they see them as responsible. They see them as a global leader they can trust. And that's why they're making giant strides all over the world. And that's just a statement of fact. That's not an opinion anymore, because they're everywhere. And it took, I think, till about 2018 that the Trump administration were finally the first administration that went, hang on, everywhere we go, there's China there, there's Russia there. Why didn't we know about this? Well, they didn't know about it because they believed these two nations were washed up nobodies. The Russians had been nothing since the Tsars, and the Chinese had been nothing since the dynasties of yesteryear. And in reality, of course, it was anything but what was going on, and has been, particularly probably in the last decade or so. I mean, 2008 was a pivotal moment for lots of reasons. Not least, it was the end of the Western financial system, but it was the start of where then, in earnest, the Belt and Road, or the New Silk Road, as it was called, or whatever variation of name you want to give it. That was the embryonic stage. That's when the AIIB started. And okay, the BRICS is what it is, and the BRICS is not the most successful organization, but it was the starting point. It doesn't mean there's not cooperation. Obviously, huge cooperation between Russia and China. Russia and India, yes. India and China, no, but it's getting a bit better. Brazil, yes, but it's on and off because, Brazil, once Bolsonaro was in, then the relationships all started to sour because he was a very convenient president for the Americans to have him. But anyway, getting back to the point, that was the embryonic time of when all these relationships started to change. And here we are in 2021, and there's thousands of examples that prove what we said. So it's not an opinion, it's a stated fact.
Yeah, and Paul, I'm not sure if you caught this in the news, and this could be a path in terms of Mexico's attempt to push back against the illicit drug trade, and that's the fact that just yesterday Mexico did approve the largest national cannabis legalization bill. I'm not sure how close it mirrors Canada's attempt, but this could be potentially a first step. And in regards to the the illicit drug trade, where most people miss the entire understanding of it, is just it's a matter of economics. It's a matter that anytime that you have a demand, you will always have someone willing to put the risk to provide whatever that is, right? Whatever it's made.
Yes.
And a few countries have actually seen some pretty good results with the decriminalization of certain drugs and how they backstop that with certain treatment things to really eliminate the illicit trade of it, if you will. And it's just a matter of supply and demand. And as long as you have a demand of something, there's going to always be willing to supply that. And that's how it originally got started from day one back in the day. But it'd be very interesting to see Russia and China's involvement, to see what that looks like in the next several years, and for the most part for the safety of people in Mexico. It's
Yes.
There are certain parts of Mexico where it's just extremely dangerous, and then you have the drug cartels willing to use children to help with the illicit movement across in the United States, because they know the prosecution laws. They know that once those kids are returned, they're literally put back on the streets, and they can turn around and do it again. So yeah, it's very interesting to witness this all together in regards to the what we're perceived is a pivot of Mexico, and one can only think what type of steps are being planned out in terms of any type of color revolution or something happening in Mexico.
Yeah, I don't think it's likely to happen. Because I think at the end of the day, in some ways, the drug cartels have a huge amount of power, and you don't want to start, sort of angering them to any great degree. And that's always been a difficult relationship for the Americans to have with in that regard, and also for any Mexican president. But just one point worth making briefly is the fact that the US has shifted this point of conflict, and there's now suggestions, and it's something I've discussed on my own podcast quite often, which is a very troubling development, is that there may be deployment of American intermediate range missiles, surprise, surprise, in the Asia Pacific, which for the Russian foreign ministry says, well, you're going to trigger a new arms race and obviously standoff. So, there's reports, and that's been circulating, and I think in the Japanese media recently again, that Washington is trying to get its vassal state of Tokyo to discuss putting American hardware inside Japan. This is not a new development, by the way. This is the Trump administration was trying to browbeat Abe for years to do this, and he refused to acquiesce to those demands because it's a deeply unpopular decision internally. And obviously, we know back in 2019, the summer, Trump pulled out of the INF Treaty. because those weapons were completely forbidden. Oh, what a surprise. They blamed it on the Russians, pulled out of it, and now they're going, well, we can put American intermediate range and short range ground missiles in the Asia Pacific because we pulled out of a treaty and blamed it on the Russians. And of course, that will have a destabilizing effect on regional security. I mean, the argument is they're going to point it at the Chinese, but of course, anyone who knows geography knows that in that region you've got the Russian Far East, and therefore any of those intermediate range missiles are effectively pointing at Russia as well. So, is it going to start a new arms race? Well, there's a risk of it, and there's the United States accusing China and Russia of stoking tensions in parts of the world. Well, once again, it's the United States who are being seen to take an aggressive posture, and of course, the Russians will have to respond. I mean, if they don't, then they look weak, and the Russian people would take. Excuse me. Would just bear with me a second.
No, you're fine. Yeah, yeah, they would have no choice at that point, or their people.
Yeah,
would
they're going to
begin
have to respond. Yeah, they'd have to respond. So the problem is that, God, my voice has gone croaky. That it is an alarming development, and not long ago that then what was it, U.S. Secretary of Defense Mark Esper was going, well, we're planning on putting more missiles in Europe and Asia, and of course the INF Treaty was signed by Gorbachev and Reagan, and at that time, it prohibited, the Soviet Union, the US from producing or deploying those kind of missiles, and of course the United States went, well, we're leaving, and blaming it on Moscow complying, but of course we knew why they were doing this, and this is an aggressive posture. Ultimately, it will create a destabilizing influence, but the truth is, it's not because the US wants to go to war with China and Russia. It's just an excuse to try and move into another theater of conflict, to spend enormous amounts of money on missiles, missile defense systems, weapons, put troops, and all. I mean, if you've got the Western Front with the NATO allies, the Baltic republics, Poland, etc., in facing Russia, and now you've got the Eastern Front, effectively, which is, let's put them in Japan so they can point at Russia and China. And again, it's just another idiotic posture. It is ultimately very damaging to US relations and with its supposed allies, because the backlash will be huge in Japan. It is only likely to stoke problems and tensions with North Korea, because North Korea will say, hang on, you're putting these in because you're going to point them at us as well. And the last thing you want to do is start a nuclear escalation with the North Koreans. So again, it's a very troubling development. We can't dismiss it, even though a World War III is not the outcome. But as ever, it poses, existential risk, because there's always a problem that somebody accidentally does something, or someone responds to a situation in an inappropriate way, but it could start a potential conflict, and that's why you need de-escalation. But the US is trying to escalate now. Why? Because China is the arch enemy for all the reasons we've discussed previously. And of course, Russia remains the arch enemy, because if it wasn't an arch enemy, NATO wouldn't exist. And Russia and Germany would instantly effectively have a unified approach to everything. It would be a hammer blow to what's left. And even though the US empire is collapsing, but historically, of course, it wasn't. And that's why NATO exists. That's why there has to be this buffer and this idea that Russia's this dangerous adversary we need to contain, because if you don't do that, then there's no reason to have NATO. There's no reason for the US to spend $750 billion a year on their military instead of spending $750 billion a year, making the livelihood of Americans that much better. And for me, I'm still staggered just how few Americans see this. It's absolutely staggering. It should be the first thing they're going, hang on, our country lacks infrastructure. It lacks, an adequate, affordable healthcare system. All the institutions that should make America a great nation internally are being starved of investment for decades. And instead, we're spending trillions protecting apparently America's interests in nations thousands of miles away from America. And why is this still not a pivotal debate amongst American people saying this is unacceptable? But still, apparently not. So I don't know what it takes. Maybe it will take the collapse, sadly, of America in totality before the people go, hang on, what are you now going to do to rebuild America? And then there'll be backlash saying, well, we're not going to support the idea of military interventionism to the tune of trillions of dollars globally.
Yeah, very well said, Paul. Paul, always a great discussion with you. Our time always just literally just flies by, but as our Gadfly subscribers know, we will be back real soon to do this again with other great topics. So, Paul, thank you for your time today. And
yes, a pleasure as ever.
Yep, let's do this again real soon.
Yes, absolutely.